Yo, it's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here with another podcast episode of the Flex Diet Podcast. Today, I'm super excited. I had a wonderful chat. You'll get to listen here with my buddy, Dr. Dom D'Agostino. We did a uber nerdy chat all about red light, photobiomodulation, ketones, fasting, and zapping monkeys. This podcast is brought to you by the Flex Diet certification. If you want 8 different interventions on how to get better and to maximize your nutrition and recovery as an individual, or if you are a trainer working with clients, you want a complete system of how to work with everything from protein, carbohydrates, fasting, sleep, and much more. Go to flexdiet.com. You'll be able to get all the information there and learn more about the Flex Diet certification. So I love this chat. I first got to meet Dom, I think going back almost 11-ish years ago. I had lunch with him and his wonderful wife at Experimental Biology Conference. And Dr. Dom D'Agostino has a PhD. As we get into, he's done lots of other stuff in neurology also. He is an associate professor with a tenure at the University of South Florida. He teaches students in the College of Medicine and also the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology. He focuses on the areas of neuropharmacology, medical biochemistry, physiology, neuroscience, and neuropharmacology, which is all the really uber big nerdy words. He's also a research scientist at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, IHMC, which he's there to assist their offering and optimize safety, health, and resilience of warfighters and astronauts. So he's done a fair amount of work with NASA. He's done the original work that was looking at a ketogenic supplement, a ketone ester specifically, to target oxygen toxicity. So this can happen when Navy SEAL divers use something called a rebreather mask, and having them do a ketogenic diet hardcore for 3 days before a deployment was just not really possible. So he was one of the early pioneers looking at, can you give them an exogenous ketone or ketone ester, which are now on the market, so are ketone salts, and does that put them into a high state of ketosis? So elevating their blood levels of ketones, and it actually does. I got to test out some of the very early versions of this from the guy who was manufacturing them for Dom's lab, and they taste utterly horrible. Even some of the ones on the market now I think are pretty horrible. Played around with them a fair amount. Super fascinating area. So in this talk, we get into all sorts of stuff from red light therapy, or what's called photobiomodulation. How does that work? Does it help recovery? Dom talks about his experience with it with wound healing. Also, the ketogenic diet has been shown to be beneficial with wound healing. And as we recorded this, Dom was literally just finishing up a 72-hour fast. So we got into all the different measurements he's doing from urine and blood and ketones and glucose and even other neurochemicals, and super fascinating. When I started this podcast, I initially had everything written out, all the things I wanted to talk about, all my notes, and then realized I was just finishing up a 72-hour fast, so we just started nerding out over that, including everything else. So you're going to get dropped into the middle of the nerd storm here, and you may have to pause this and go look up different words like DCA and things like that. But I still wanted to do this podcast since every time I talk to Dom, I always learn a ton of stuff. We get into the keto diet, what is really a ketogenic diet, how can you use fasting, of course, metabolic flexibility. So I got to pick his brain about what are optimal levels of carbohydrates, other things such as the PDH enzyme, which is pyruvate dehydrogenase. If you hear that come up, You can just simply think of it as the gatekeeper to glycolysis, so carbohydrate metabolism. So Dom is a fan of keeping some carbohydrates in your diet to keep that little PDH guy running well. And then I go off on a little bit of a tangent about my master's work, zapping monkeys with ray guns. So check out this episode with Dr. Dom D'Agostino. Last point at the end, we get into one of my favorite topics, which is lactate. Can we get some type of supplement for lactate and performance? I've been kind of going on and on about this for about 7 years now. Dom was one of the only people out of just a handful of people I can name literally on one hand who, when I proposed this idea, didn't think I was absolutely batshit crazy. So if anyone's listening and you want to go further with that, or some of the ideas for neuroprotection we talk about at the end, you know where to find me. So check out this awesome episode with Dr. Dom D'Agostino. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. Greatly appreciate it. I know you're a busy man with like 100 projects going on there, so.
Yeah, glad to be on. Actually, I'm fasting, and at 6 o'clock it'll be 72 hours since I've eaten anything.
Oh my gosh!
I'm gonna go do a deadlift challenge after that. So I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor.
Yeah, I saw that on Facebook.
Yeah, so right now my glucose is like 48 to 52, and my ketones are like 4 millimolar. So
oh wow,
the blood concentration of my ketones are significantly higher than my glucose. So basically my brain is being run off ketones, and I haven't really fasted in a while. I haven't been as strict with the ketogenic diet. I do low carb. So this is kind of like a new thing for me. I'm testing out.
Interesting. So what kind of massive deadlift weight are you doing?
Well, I did like right before I started, I was kind of eating carbs. I was eating a lot of watermelon, popcorn, dark chocolate, sweet potatoes, just to see what it would do to my CGM.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and my body weight got up to like, I was hovering at like 218, then it was like a little bit above 220. Right now it's 211.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's went down like 10 pounds. And I think that's just because I had eaten some carbs before. And then I tested my strength. I did 6 plates for 5 or 6, I think.
Nice.
So I have the deadlift area set up now. So we'll see what happens. I can tell, like, I've lost some volume. I might not have that low end gear, so it'll be interesting to see. I'm kind of deflated, so I'm very interested to see if that'll translate into a deficit in the max lift, because I haven't really done this in a while. So it's kind of like an experiment, and I'm doing right now. I've took saliva, breath analysis, blood, urine. I took a whole bunch of tests, so I'm about to send that to the lab tomorrow morning. So we'll see what the 3-day.
Cool. And a quick question. Are you good for an hour? Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Cool. We can just start. I already started the recording, so I'll do an intro later. Okay. So this is great.
Okay. Yeah. You can
what markers are you looking at then? Sounds like you did the whole gamut.
Yeah. Well, I have like different devices. Like, I have the GKI glucose ketone monitor, and then I have, similar. I have the Precision Extra. And then I have a breath ketone analyzer that does acetone. And I just packaged this out. This is a cardiometabolic kit we use for our NASA missions, and it does insulin, which is very useful. So I measure insulin a lot, insulin response to different things, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, hemoglobin A1C, it does a lipid panel, a few other things, but the things that I'm usually interested in is insulin, C-reactive protein, hemoglobin A1C, and some of the lipid stuff, but not as interested in that. It's not as accurate, but the other markers I mentioned correlate pretty well with Quest Labs and LabCorp.
Okay.
And then I have urine neurotransmitters, so I measure my neurotransmitters.
Is that useful, do you think, doing neurotransmitters in the urine? Because you're looking at metabolite breakdown, right, obviously?
Yeah, it does. I mean, like if you take GABA or 5-HTP, like you can send things through the roof. But if you're if you're not taking any supplements and you go from a normal standard diet to a ketogenic diet, I think it's actively picking up GABA to glutamate ratios,
Hmm.
catecholamines. It kind of correlates to the brain data. If you take the CSF or pieces of brain out and look at GABA to glutamate ratios, that's a function of glutamic acid decarboxylase. So we look at the different GAD enzymes. But I'm doing like cortisol, like saliva cortisol
Okay.
testing. Yeah, I'm doing a whole bunch of things, so I'm just kind of making a big experiment out of it.
Well, that's cool. Do you have
Always testing.
a metabolic cart to do any measurements like that? I'm just curious.
I don't. I wish I'd like to have that. I mean, Bill Campbell, as you know,
Yeah,
he's
I
on
love Bill.
USF.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's got a
he's
he's
got
got a
his. I know.
car, and a couple other people I know have carts, but I don't have one at my house. So that's one thing I'd like to get.
Yeah,
That's probably be one of
I
the
have
more
the
useful things.
PNOE device, and I
Oh, do
like
you?
it so far. It's been pretty good, actually. Yeah, and you
Yeah,
can gas cal it. You can do breath by breath. So again,
yeah.
there's two validation studies they have on it, and it's been pretty good, actually. I've been kind of surprised because I didn't, for a metabolic cart that's around 6 grand. I mean, that's still expensive, but a lot cheaper than some of the other ones. So my first
Yeah,
question is always like, I don't know if it's really that accurate, but I don't know. I mean, it appears to be
I've heard
pretty
good things
good.
about it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. That'll
interesting.
probably be the next on the list that I get. Yeah, I mean, I've bought a lot of far more expensive stuff that's not as useful. So, like atomic force microscope, it's like
Oh my
half a
gosh.
million these are things I bought a long time ago with Department of Defense funding and stuff like that. But
You don't have these in your
yeah,
house, right?
no, I
No.
have behind me. I don't know if you can see behind me. I have the Juve system, the Juve Elite system. I
Oh,
don't
okay.
know that white thing back there. It's like facing the wall. Like
What's the
that's like
difference with
eight
that?
grand, but it's red light therapy and also does infrared. And I do it the days like today. I'll deadlift and I'll do a session on the Juve. I think it's helping recovery to some extent. Science is not too great. It's a lot of marketing, I haven't been able to quantify any objective, data to say it's actually working. Subjectively, it feels good. Like you get in it, and there's something about it. And if I do it too close to sleep, it stimulates me so much I can't fall asleep. So I
Interesting.
tend to do it like I try to do it no later than this usually.
And that's the photobiomodulation. So you've got the red light and you've got the
Yeah,
near infrared also, correct?
yeah, mhm.
Yeah, I have a red light therapy one that I bought, just a 2 panel one. And I've had it for, man, almost a year now. And kind of similar to you. It's like, at first I'm like, oh my God, that's horrible. There's like no research on that at all. And I'm like, well, maybe I should actually look before I say that. And you
There's
look and there's
research.
some
Yeah.
very interesting stuff. There was way more than I thought I was going to
Yep.
find.
Yep.
Um, but in performance, there's some studies that were, pretty positive. There were some that were like, eh. And I
Hmm.
thought, well, I'll give it a go. And what I noticed kind of unintentionally, my mid back area, like my rhomboids and stuff, and my lats started getting like really sore. I didn't think anything of it. I thought it's because I changed routines. I thought I did something else. And then I realized the outer part of my quads was more sore, but the inner wasn't really at all. And I'm like, oh, maybe it's just because I've been doing more aerobic stuff. I've been doing more rowing or something like that. And then I realized, I'm like, wait a minute, what position have I been in the light? Oh, when I would turn around, my upper back was way closer to the light than when I was facing it. I didn't realize that. And so then I did an area where I'm like, oh, because of the way I was sitting, it was actually hitting my outer quads and not the inside. So it was missing like the VMO area. So then I did the inverse. So I just basically stuck my VMO like up against the light for quite a while. And then it actually flipped. And there's like no research I've seen on like muscle activation or anything like that I can find. It was just, it was bizarre, but I've been able to reproduce it, which is weird. And I don't
Yeah,
know
that
why
is.
that would be. It doesn't even make any sense to me.
Yeah, I'm looking at things to measure like skin, like dermal ATP levels. I'm kind of interested. Its legitimate applications are wound healing,
Yeah,
like FDA approved, and maybe a little bit with like seasonal affective disorder and maybe depression and things like that. So I do feel like a boost in mood, but I'm not
yeah.
really I'm always pretty happy anyway. So it's like I don't know how to assess that, but although I was out. My wife and I go barefoot walking every morning with the dogs and the cows and everything. And I cut my foot open on a palm frond that has like these razor sharp
Ooh.
things, and I healed up like amazingly fast.
Hmm.
So I thought I was going to have stitches, and I've been using the red light therapy, and that's one area where in a wound bed you have a deficiency of ATP, so
Right.
stimulating energy production in the wound bed enhances the healing process. And yeah, I never thought I mean, I could see the meat, I could see like the muscle,
Oh.
like way through the skin, way into the muscle, and it was just like looking at a piece of meat, and now the whole thing's like healed up in like 3 days. So I don't know, maybe it's fasting too or whatever, but and I don't. I deadlifted the other day. Was it before I started this? And I was really sore, and I was like, "Well, I'm not going to be able to deadlift at the end of this because I'll still be sore." And yesterday I was feeling it. I was doing a lot of farmers walks because I'm just moving block around the property. And today I have no perceptive soreness at all
Hmm.
from that session. So I was going to extend it fast to tomorrow morning and do it, but I kind of want to eat. I could smell. I have some stuff cooking right now, so I can smell it. Your sense of smell is very heightened when you're
Oh, I bet.
fasting, so I can like smell exactly what's cooking. So
Do you think on the red light, because I've seen from what I've read, correct me if I'm wrong, is there is a little penetration into the muscle, although it's not super, super deep. Do you think there's any muscle effect? And then two, how close, because it's all modulated basically by distance to the light, assuming you've got one that's relatively high power, it's got the right frequency. Like how
hmm
close do you get to it? Any idea of like length of time to build up to?
well, like tissue penetration
Yeah,
first,
first
right?
does
Like
it penetrate the tissue, and then what kind
yeah.
of properties would you use with it, I guess?
So, from the brain perspective, there's some data to indicate it can go up to like 1,000 microns, which is like 1 centimeter. But I would pretty confident to say it can penetrate up to 250 microns to 500 microns, which is a quarter to a half a centimeter. And then it's having effects, on the tissue under that just by virtue of affecting the tissue on top, by stimulating mitochondrial activity, maybe some vascular flow, blood flow, things like that. Uh, but a lot of what I've read is on the brain because I was interested in using it sort of on the brain, and but there's some indication that it could go a couple like a millimeter or 2 millimeters in. But
Yeah,
it depends on the type of laser. There's also a question about the frequencies of the lasers, the specific bandwidth of the laser or wavelength. So there's a lot of unknowns there, and the companies really need to start putting some science behind their devices, and I think they are. I think there's legit science, but not for the performance, you know, arena.
yeah. So for the photobiomodulation, like the red light stuff, how close do you sit to it? Do you get pretty close, and for about how long do you usually go for a session?
Yeah, like that unit behind me, it's a full body unit. So I will do like no clothes, 10 minutes front and 10 minutes back for like full session sometimes. Or
Oh, okay.
sometimes if I'm in a hurry and I just do back, I'll just do just the back, and I usually just like do emails or something or listen to something so it's pretty relaxing. I feel like, and I have a smaller unit too, the Elite, the Juve Elite, the
Okay.
smaller box, but
Yeah.
that's the Elite Pro. And I mean, you can really tell it's doing something. It's stimulating. It's a very powerful laser. I mean, I could stick it on in my house, and our property is like a quarter mile away from the road. And if you're driving by our house and look in the windows, like every light, it looks like there's like red lights just beaming
Yeah.
out the windows. It's like super powerful. So it's a pretty high end unit.
And are you pretty close to it, like distance wise from your skin, or?
Yeah, about I would say I try to get about 4 to 6 inches.
Oh,
So
okay. So you're pretty close.
I back up and touch it, and then I just kind of walk forward a little bit and just kind of stay there. And it's warm, but it's not hot. You know, like you can definitely feel the intensity.
Yeah, we. So talking about making your house look weird. I turn it on at night. I'll turn the near infrared off and just turn the red light on, and we'll close all the drapes and stuff for more of a biological effect. And I was outside getting the mail late at night once, and I'm looking, and I'm like, holy shit, like our house looks like we're living in like the red light district or something, because you see like all these red coming out of like the living room windows. I'm like, oh, the neighbors are probably wondering about that.
Yeah. It's like, it could be like a Christmas ornament or something like that. A Christmas sign. Yeah, it just lights up the entire house. All our walls are white, so it just tends to just like saturate the whole house.
Yeah. Have you played much with the Vilight, where you're basically sticking it up your nose to try to get more access to the brain and maybe default mode network changes in the brain, possibly?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, and I've talked to the people behind the company. I think they're at a conference I was attending.
Yeah.
I have not used it though, but it's a pretty interesting concept. And I'm not completely, well, I think they do. They back up some of they have some science.
They've got some science behind it. I would say not a ton from what I've seen.
Yeah,
but yeah. A buddy of mine, he's a neurologist here. He does some, and I've had it done to me from him, lasers that are supposedly targeting more of the deep brain areas, I guess. And I can't remember the name of it, but it's got basically 2 from each side and 1 from the top. So in theory, you can kind of triangulate it to hit specific brain areas. I think it's a cold laser. According to him, he's seen pretty good results. So they'll do a bunch of eye motor function testing before and after. And he said he's seen some pretty good results from it, but I don't understand it, to be honest. I'll just take his word for it.
Yeah, people are just kind of playing with these things and just trying to get results out of it. But I think there's science behind it, but what it's doing systemically and what it's doing from like a neural network point of view, we just don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a pretty cool field. Like if I was an up and coming PhD student, I might actually, gravitate towards a project on photobiomodulation. It's kind of that interesting to me.
Yeah, because I think it's like a lot of fields, like the stuff I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's a lot of mechanistic data. There's definitely a good sound principle. There's some good background. But like the questions I'm interested from at least a sports performance standpoint, there's just not that much data that I can find. And that would be, I don't want to say it's an easy study to run, but I mean, all things being, equal, it's a pretty good master's project, to do. Get a group of people, put them X distance away, monitor their compliance, pick whatever parameters you want to measure pre and post. It's not anything that you're going to need an MRI or just, your $500,000, microscope or anything like that to possibly measure. So, yeah.
Yeah, if it's altering hormones like testosterone, cortisol, and other hormones, then by virtue of hormonal optimization, which I think some of the companies claim, then you could be speeding performance. But a direct photobiomodulation effect on the muscle would require like muscle biopsies and things like that. So you need a kind of an in-depth, analysis to really figure out what's going on.
Yeah, especially mechanistic wise, I think it gets kind of messy because I think isn't part of it cytochrome C oxidase is supposed to be upregulated, so therefore you have more local ATP and therefore potentially more performance enhancement. And the studies I've seen on that direct effect are like super mixed. The ones that were positive were like pretty positive and appeared to be pretty well done, and then some of them were like, it didn't seem to do much.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of applications for photobiomodulation, but I think performance is kind of low on the list at this point when it comes to science, at least. But recovery, I think it may have some applications for recovery, but we'll see.
Do you think there's a time effect, like just from chronobiology in terms of, we know when the sun is coming up that there's more red light in it? Mm-hmm. The one thing I've tried to do is if I'm doing it for a longer session, I'll do it in the morning. My thought being maybe that's kind of simulating sunrise from the red light perspective into my eyeballs. Do you think there's anything to that, or who knows?
Yeah, I think I'm a big fan. I don't have it like in my house now, but being able to install lights that both synchronize with the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And, I have to do stuff outside in the morning. So I like to get, that burst of sun in the morning, and I'm just, at my desk now looking out, out. Natural light is like huge for me over the years. I've
Yeah.
learned that. And I think, during a big part of my PhD training and postdoctoral training, I was just in a dark room with no, either working on the microscope or even my office had no windows. And I
Yep.
don't think I can't go back to that. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of, and I just feel so much better when I have natural light. But to answer your question, I think there's good rationale for that, for getting a burst of red light in the morning and maybe early evening or late afternoon too.
Yeah, very cool. So what prompted you to do your 72-hour fast? I know we're kind of skipping all over creation here, so.
Yeah. Well, I'm using a Freestyle Libra Pro continuous glucose monitoring system
Cool.
with the NutriSense app. And
Yeah, I've seen
I
that.
love the NutriSense app. It's more geared towards like lifestyle and fitness sort of,
Not really
CGM
diabetics.
measurements.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it caters to both, but I was, able to get it without a prescription and just, talk to them and let them know exactly how I'm going to be using it. So I had 2 weeks to use this, and I've had prescriptions before written for me, but I'm like in and out of the water all the time. I'm
Mm,
doing stuff on the farm, banging myself around, and I figure I just destroy the thing. But I mean, it's on my arm now.
tricep.
See, like,
Yeah.
yeah, like back there. So, and I banged it around, and it's still hanging on. It's been in the water. Tomorrow we're going to the beach, so I'm good. I've abstained from salt water. But basically, I was like, I'm doing continuous glucose monitoring. I wanted to test. A big question is like, if you go on low carb or ketogenic diets, does it make you carbohydrate intolerant?
Yeah.
Does it decrease your metabolic flexibility? So my metabolic flexibility must be off the charts. My PDH must be like skyrocketed because I can eat, massive amounts of sugar from watermelon, popcorn, dark chocolate, things like that. And I can't even get my glucose over 120
Mm,
until I eat carbs, so I make myself sick. My stomach was like bloated. So for me, but I think if I had, sustained a very strict ketogenic diet, and did that, because in the past I've noticed big postprandial excursions if I eat a little bit of carbs. And I think just simply adding small amounts of carbs over the last 2 years, I was strict with the ketogenic diet for a couple of years when I was doing research. But I think all you have to do is add maybe 50 to 100 grams a day. And I think you're keeping that metabolic glycolytic pathway open, and PDH complex too. And I take alpha lipoic acid 600 milligrams in the morning and 600 at night too.
mm.
So even with my carb meals, I take alpha lipoic acid, part of the PDH complex, and it can help decrease postprandial excursions in glucose. So I mean, getting back to your question, the main thing that motivated me to do this 72-hour fast was that, hey, I'm using this system, this continuous glucose monitoring system. Let's test as many things rigorously as possible. So that's why I'm doing all the blood work, the urine, the breath analysis, the saliva, cortisol, and hormones, and things like that. So I just want to make the most of this experience. And I was genuinely interested in what my glucose was doing during sleep, because I've never,
Yeah. You're not gonna
and
wake up and poke yourself, and even if you did, then you've got the confiscating thing of waking
yeah,
yourself up and poking yourself.
yeah. And it's amazing how my late night munchies really impacts my highest glucose levels were always at nighttime when I was sleeping. And
Really?
now since I've been
Huh.
fasting, I'm staying like about 60 throughout the fast, sometimes dipping down to like low 50s or high 40s.
Wow. That's
And
low.
right now, I think it was 52 or 48 when I got on this podcast with you. And in millimolar concentrations, my ketones are higher than my glucose. So, and I feel, after not eating for 3 days, I feel fine. So I think my metabolic flexibility is pretty good. I do think that you can impair, and you'd probably agree with me, you impair your metabolic flexibility if you go too low carb, too ketogenic, when I started the ketogenic diet, it was just for epilepsy and seizure
Mm-hmm.
control. So actually, and then a year or two after that, I found out Jeff Volek is studying the ketogenic diet for performance, and that was strange to me. I was like, why would you do a
Yeah.
ketogenic diet for performance? Like, I'm approaching this purely as a neuroscientist. It like didn't make sense. And I started reading. I was like, oh, I guess people are doing this for, not only body. I understood the body composition
Yeah.
a little bit, but the whole performance thing actually threw me. So the more I read into it, the more it made sense. But it was a rather extreme approach,
Yeah.
and I've warmed up to the idea. And now, I think I've come from what I know of your approach and your philosophy. I think you fall, you're like right in the middle. You're like the voice of reason behind the two. And I think,
Voice of hate
yeah,
mail from both sides.
yeah, that's always the case, right? When you're like, in the middle and you're like the voice of reason, then you get a lot of slack, flack rather.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've gravitated. I feel better low carb from a like a concentration point of view, not getting hungry. Logistically, it's better. I just, it tends to. It's convenient to go, 3 days and not get hungry. I mean, that's very convenient to me. I got a shit ton of work done. I got so much work done inside and outside, and not having to stop, prepare meals, eat a meal, clean up, go shopping. I guess I save money too. That's convenient to be able to do that. And I never thought I would feel like this, after 3 days of not eating.
And what do you consider low carb? Do you know about like how many carbs you're at per day in terms of your low carb version?
Yeah, I used Lane Norton has a pretty good app for macro counting, Carbon app. So I was using that for a couple of weeks, and I was surprised at how many calories I was consuming, because I figured I'm about at 3,400, but I was consistently getting about 39 to 4,400 calories per
Hmm.
day. Some days like 300 grams or more of fat, but my carbs were higher than I thought too. So total carbs were the lowest was like maybe 62, but
Oh, okay.
I was hitting like 120, 150. But then again, a lot of those carbs were from salad and
Sure. Fiber and everything else.
nuts,
Yeah.
avocado, broccoli. So half of it's fiber. So I don't know if you're going to do net carbs, probably like still less than 70, even on my high carb days.
Yeah, I've just noticed over the years, like right around, and again, it's hard because it's approximate of you're counting all carbs. Like 100 grams seems to be kind of a weird threshold. Like some people I find if they start going from higher carbs to like 50 grams of carbs per day, yeah, usually at that point I'm like, I'll probably just go do a ketogenic type approach. Like I call it kind of the metabolic no man's land where your carbs are so low that your body's like, I don't know what to do, but your fat's not really high enough and your ketones are not high enough to really be ketogenic. It seems to be like that's a weird place to hang out. So I tell people either go like, if you're going to do it, like go ketogenic, that's fine if that's your goal, or maybe bump your carbs up a little bit to you feel
Hmm.
better. Any thoughts on that or any
Well,
experience?
yeah, I mean, it's a good topic of discussion. I'm against, for, practical purposes, I'm against big fluctuations in macronutrient ratios, right? So if you're gonna adopt a low carb lifestyle, like I did test some things with high carbs, but generally speaking, I think you can get a lot of the benefits of low carb and ketogenic diets simply by doing a day or two of a more strict ketogenic diet and then do low carb intermittent fasting, right? Where you're just kind of at the end of the day, eating like protein and veggies and things like that. And I'm always, even on the days I'm getting, 125 grams of carbs, if I do intermittent fasting on that day, I'm basically, fueling off ketones for a good part of the day
Mm-hmm.
and feeling it, especially in the latter part of the day, feeling the benefits of that. And you're always pushing your body to like burn fat as fuel. Ketones are elevated, so by virtue of elevated ketones, your fatty acid oxidation in the muscle and in the liver, beta oxidation of fatty acids are high if you're making ketones. So I always like to ride that kind of edge where I'm always making the muscle hungry for fat, but also making it hungry for sugar, but not completely starving it of sugar because I want to keep that pathway open. But then occasionally, maybe I'll do something like a fast or strict ketogenic approach, and I can adapt to that, or I can go back to eating carbs, and I'm flexible enough that I can, eat 200 grams of sugary carbs and my glucose doesn't go above 120. So I don't think that would happen if I was on like a clinical ketogenic diet. Like the ketogenic diet gets thrown around, this term gets thrown around, but people are not really following a ketogenic diet. Well, I guess if your ketones are elevated, you are within clinical ranges, but a classical ketogenic diet is, used by people with epilepsy is really strict. Like they have to watch out taking a medication because it might have some, plant-based starch in it as a filler. Like that could kick them out of ketosis. And that will probably produce a physiological insulin resistance over time to where you do become carb intolerant. But one could also say that if you are on a high carb diet, you become fat intolerant, right? Because you're not
constantly whacking
sort
insulin
of,
up.
if your insulin is elevated, I hear this term getting thrown around maybe by the carb advocates that you become physiologically insulin resistant, and that may or may not be a good thing. And I can agree with that. But I think the same thing happens if you're a carb fueled athlete, you become fat intolerant, and elevated insulin and glucose is basically it's fat sparing. So you have your triglycerides become circulating in your blood, and this can wreak havoc too over time. So again, I think falling back on your happy medium where you're where you're doing things like doing periodic intermittent fasting, or take some athletes, and I'm sure you personalize things and make them low carb for a period of time just to test their metabolic flexibility. But I think it's really important that people need to. And I think you've coined this term. I don't know if you have like a patent or trademark on the term or something, but like when I think metabolic flexibility, I think about your approach, and what this idea that you're pushing out there. I think it's important for people to acknowledge this and not be in one camp or another. They should be in the middle.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, because to me, looking at it, obviously I kind of stumbled into it because it was my PhD research project like 13 years ago now. But the more
Has it been that long? 13 years ago?
Yeah, that's when I started it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember you were at experimental biology in like 2008 or 9. Wow.
Yeah, 2009 maybe was it? We met
9
there?
or 10 or something like that.
Yeah, the short story is that I ran away from the PhD program in biomedical engineering because I didn't want to do any more math. And I get to the physiology department. I have the first meeting. My advisor is like, all right, we got 2 new projects. One's on heart rate variability. One's on metabolic flexibility. And they both involve a lot of math. And, most PhD students in exercise phys don't take a lot of advanced math. It's just not part of the curriculum unless you're maybe doing some gait analysis or some biomechanics or some sub areas of it. And so he looks around the table and he points at me. He's like, hey, you, math boy in the back, whatever your name is, like, these are your projects. I'm like, oh, God, you got to be kidding me.
Did you take math? Did you have like
because I did a master's in mechanical engineering. So I had a minor in mathematics. Yeah, which
very cool.
Math for me was like super hard. Like like when I did my undergrad, like trying to get through calculus 1, 2, 3, 4 differential equations. I had so many people that I paid to like just tutor me. Like I'm like, just help me. I don't know what's going on. And then I would go back and rework problems like 4 times, and it was
that seems like a whole nother life. Like for me, that's like 1994 or 5 or something. But I remember just that was probably the hardest semester that I ever had because I took calculus, physics, organic chem, and then a few other. I had 21 credits that semester, and I had to, I went to class, but I also went to like a learning center to get like extra, training on calculus. And I remember it was like drudgery. I didn't like it, and I don't ever use it. I don't think I use it at all. But I think it teaches you how to learn, a certain way. And actually, I got a good grade in it, but I just had to work harder than normal. I'm a physiologist, biologist by training, and then I went through a neuroscience program. But I think calculus and probably physics were probably the hardest courses. I kind of liked them, and I knew they'd be important, so I worked really hard. But it was just like I had to put more effort into that than other like biology or genetics or microbiology and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember sitting through anatomy and physiology, and that was the only class.
That was best.
I could just not really study for. You know, like I could just sit
Yeah.
there and lecture, pay attention, do my reading, and like I would study like maybe a half hour for the test. And everyone's like just like freaking out, losing their minds. But then I would be, sitting in engineering classes with people that didn't even like barely complete their math homework and would like ace the exams. And I'm like doing problems like 3 or 4 times and giving myself quizzes and all sorts of stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. I don't envy those days. I watch my PhD students go through classes, and I'm like, and I teach too, and it's like, I kind of have to prepare a lot for a lecture, and I think that I just finished a neuropharmacology summer course, and thinking,
Oh wow.
man, the students get bombarded with like 3 hours of lecture per day, and they have to it's like drinking from a fire hose, And I teach antipsychotics, I teach dopamine, and a few other things. But it's pretty intense. Yeah. I like, actually that was probably the hardest I've ever worked as a PhD student, I think.
Yeah.
Taking courses and running and doing experiments. I mean, I have to manage and parallel process a gazillion things now, but I think when it comes to when you're just completely focused on your PhD project and you're taking courses, that was probably the hardest I've ever worked.
Oh yeah. Like my master's in mechanical engineering, in terms of just the sheer difficulty of the stuff, was like way harder than my PhD, because I ended up doing heat transfer stuff. I made this big model of monkey in front of a big microwave transmitter. So I did solid mechanics, biomechanics work, but I couldn't get funded. So I ended up having to go to the Center for Biomedical Engineering, teach myself heat transfer and basically solid heat transfer, and then to do a project on top of that. So I remember sitting in like this heat transfer class.
Like heating the monkey with microwaves?
Yeah.
Is that what you're doing?
Yeah. So
that's a hell of a project.
Because I asked him, I said, hey, oh, we got this new project, we got funding. My advisor is like, but it involves heat transfer. And I'm like, okay, I did solid mechanics, so there's a couple of classes I didn't take. Yeah, I took thermal, I took all the basic stuff, but I didn't take advanced, heat transfer. I didn't take conduction heat transfer theory. He's like, well, here's the book on heat transfer. You've got 3 weeks over Christmas break. Just teach yourself. I'm like, what? I got to go home and work to pay for college, number one. So at night, I'm sitting there after working in the restaurant, like trying to teach myself heat transfer, which was just abysmal. Because he's like, yeah, we enrolled you in basically conduction heat transfer through solid materials. And it's a 500 level class, and you start in January. And what he also forgot to tell me was there was another math requirement for the class that I didn't complete. So you do like calculus 1, 2, 3, 4, differential equations 1, 2, and then there's something called Bessel equations, which is like a subfraction of all of those. Well, I didn't have basically the class where you taught Bessel equations. So I'm sitting there going, I don't know what the fuck's going on in any of this class. I don't know anything that's going on. And then when you're in your grad student, you can't get below a B, or you lose funding. You're just out of the program. Yep. So I ended up getting such a poor grade in it, even after studying forever, that I ended up having to drop the class. But I had to stay in it because my research was on it. So I dropped the class and still just kind of eventually muddled my way through it and figured it out. But we designed a computer-generated model of a primate head in front of a big microwave transmitter. But the transmitter was in the gigahertz range, so millimeter wave exposure. So if you go super high in frequency, your penetration depth is like less than a millimeter. So what it does is it lights up all the sympathetic nerve endings on your skin. And it feels like your skin is being burnt by a light bulb. But because there's no deep tissue heating effect, there's no cell necrosis, there's no cell death or anything like that.
Oh, like as a weapon.
As a weapon, yeah.
Yeah, as a weapon, for like crowd control and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, years later, like 5 years later when I was done, because I published it, and I'm like, hey, who's like these 2-3 guys from like Brooks Air Force Base in Texas? It's like, I know you're sponsoring my project. And like 5 years later, a little clip from the paper he sends me, he goes, yeah, your project is now declassified. I'm like, declassified? It's like, yeah, it was so classified we couldn't tell you it was classified. I'm like, well, I kind of knew something was a little funky. But that's actually what it was for, is it's called the active denial system. So they put it on the back of a car. It's this huge microwave transmitter. You point it at a crowd of people. Feels like your skin's being burnt by a light bulb, so then it's non-lethal crowd dispersion.
Wow. What's the range on something like
I think
that?
it's
Is
up
that
to a
even like
quarter mile.
a mile?
A quarter
Wow.
mile, yeah.
Wow.
It's
Huh. Yeah,
long.
kind of read about these, but I thought like the theoretical framework was there, but I didn't know they actually had like a these things operational.
Yeah, and what's funny is I did some work for DARPA several years ago on metabolic flexibility for soldiers and things of that nature. And
Huh?
I was talking to one of the guys there, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I had that tested on me." He's like, "I was one of the operators of it." I'm like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah." I said, "Well,"
Uh,
I said, "What do you do like if like someone's still running at you in the beam?" He's like, "Well, they're clearly a threat then, so we shoot them."
yeah.
I'm like, I thought about it. He's like, oh yeah. He's like, the beam hurts so bad. He's like, anyone who stays in there is either deranged or going to cause you harm. So he's like, they are clearly a threat at that point. I was like, oh, okay.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They said the military doesn't use it as much because their whole history and everything is not really based on non-lethal methods, if you think about it. So he's like,
Yeah.
how it fits in, they're not
And for
really
crowd
sure.
control, it's ethically questionable, right? To use
Exactly.
it on like rioters or
Yep.
even like looters or something like that. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you can just imagine the media headlines. Ray gun
Yeah.
used on looters. It's like, ooh, that
Yeah.
doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
uh, Interesting. Um, Changing subjects a little bit, but I know we've talked over the years about lactate as a
Mhm.
supplement. And
Yeah.
you're one of the only people, whenever I mention this, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Everyone else looks at me like I'm a four-headed, like, space alien that I'd want to even consider giving lactate as a potential supplement. But what are your thoughts for performance?
Yeah.
I know George Brooks's lab has done it for IV infusions with TBI, traumatic brain injury stuff.
Sure. I got interested in lactate. Actually, this goes back to 1990 or 91. In football, I used a product called Cytomax, which is
Yes,
alpha L polylactate.
exactly.
And I became interested in lactate. And then I revisited lactate as an undergrad going into grad school because I studied the neural control of autonomic regulation, specifically the rostral ventral lateral medulla neurons. And
Ah,
it's a brainstem mechanism where you have inspiratory neurons and expiratory neurons. Within the inspiratory neuron bed, there is the pre-Botzinger complex, and this is the O2 chemosensitive region of the brain
hmm.
that senses oxygen. Believe it or not, the brain has an oxygen sensor. So
So it's sort of like
classically,
the backup to CO2 is how I think of it. Is that correct?
yeah. So classically, the O2 sensors are located at the carotid bodies, which is at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery. So you have these CO2 sensors, and then people in the field, my field, studied the O2 sensing mechanisms of the carotid body.
Hmm.
But some studies were done to indicate that there was a backup redundant mechanism in the pre-Botzinger complex of the rostral ventral lateral medulla. So I studied the O2 sensing mechanisms
Hmm.
of these neurons and their response to hypoxia. And it was sort of, and it's still something that's being studied now, the O2 sensing mechanism, if that fails, you don't gasp. There's
Right.
gasping at the end of life, and it's called terminal gasping. But when you're sleeping or you become hypoxic, you'll actually gasp. And infants gasp if they get pushed onto their face and they're smothered by a pillow, they'll gasp.
Hmm.
And that it's an auto-resuscitory mechanism that's hardwired into us.
Hmm.
And failure to gasp has been implicated in the etiology of SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome.
Oh.
So, there's an interest there, and also for something called, there's obstructive sleep apnea, but also central sleep apnea.
Mm-hmm.
So I studied that. So anyway, like I took these brain regions out. I studied them in the animal, outside the animal. I studied them in primary dissociated cell cultures, and looking at their O2 sensing mechanisms. And also, I became kind of interested in making cells more resilient. So I had, hippocampal neurons and cortex neurons,
Hmm.
and I was like hitting them with toxins and stuff. And I was like, if the brain is under hypoxia, it does start making lactate from glucose. So what if
Yeah,
we
it has
just give
to.
lactate?
Yeah.
I was thinking lactate as a supplement, and I was just tinkering around in the lab doing electrophysiological studies. Like at the time, I was trained in wholesale perforated patch clamp technique,
Oh,
which
wow.
actually you can measure membrane potential,
Yep.
and if you do voltage clamp, you can do like current clamp or voltage clamp. If you look at like you can look at input resistance to figure out. So I was basically like trained in biophysics, and I started tinkering around with different metabolic substrates, and that was like early like 2000, 1999, 2000
Hmm.
to 2002. And then I got my PhD in 2004, and then I went on to develop methods to monitor reactive oxygen species formation in the brain, with
Hmm.
different forms of microscopy. But then I revisited this lactate thing, but it never came to fruition. I tinkered around in the lab, but then a couple years later, I got very interested in the ketogenic diet and then this idea of ketones,
Yeah.
and that the brain has the metabolic flexibility to adapt from using glucose to ketones. So the lactate was always like something I wanted to explore, but then I got just caught up in ketones because no one had really like people were already developing. I think there was already a patent for like different forms of lactate, but there really wasn't for ketones. There was a group in Oxford, that was
Yeah. It's
studying it,
Veach.
and it was just as I started studying it, and I was like, it just seemed like a wide open space. And then the rationale for the ketogenic diet was so solid. Like the data, I didn't even know of a ketogenic diet. I just knew it in bodybuilding circles. It was like this extreme diet that people would
Yeah.
follow. I was unfamiliar at the time. This is maybe 2006, 7, and 8. I really sort of developed this idea of using it for oxygen toxicity seizures, which is a limitation for Navy SEAL diving, and which manifests as grand mal seizures or tonic-clonic seizures. So to be able to package this idea as therapeutic ketosis delivered with a supplement instead of having a diet and having to follow that diet for 3 days before you get anti-seizure neuroprotective effects, if you could administer a supplement. But ideally, I mean, you'd want to administer a supplement of ketones and lactate and not
Yeah.
be partial to any specific fuel,
Right.
right? So
All players.
therein lies a potential, project.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's one of those things where you're like it seems almost like too obvious. Like so I started looking for data. I'm like, well, this must not work, right? You start thinking, you're like, I can't be the only person thinking about this. Like this is one of those things that has to have been done, then it just didn't work. And there's only like a handful of studies that I could find on, at least from the performance standpoint. And obviously
Yeah.
George Brooks is kind of the godfather of lactate, and he's been looking at things related to that for a long time, and there's stuff related to sort of your endogenous production of lactate from
Mm-hmm.
exercise and lactate shuttle and everything there. But as far as I can tell from a supplement, I don't know if Cytosport still owns that patent or not. There isn't really anything I could find that says that it should not work, or at least would not be able to be tested.
Yeah. Yeah. I think maybe there's a bias against lactate
Oh, there
because
definitely is
we,
a bias against lactate. I would not call it
yeah,
lactate supplement. I would be like performance
yeah,
booster or something.
yeah. Yeah, well, too, I became interested in this idea. I think my exercise physiology studied, and these were studies done at Rutgers University, I think, where DCA was given,
Mm-hmm.
even in IV, maybe couldn't take it orally at the time. But so that lowers, that's actually used for lactic acidosis,
Yeah.
and it's used clinically for that. So I became interested in this idea too of using DCA. And then later on, I started studying cancer, and I was like, oh, people were using DCA as like in clinical trials for glioblastoma. So it was like sort of reversing the Warburg effect kind of thing. So I think there's some work to be done there, looking at things like delivering an optimized, substrate formula with various cofactors, and also maybe low dose small molecule drugs that could open up metabolic pathways. So this has been something that I've been very interested in from the perspective of neurometabolic diseases, mostly, but also has major implications for performance enhancement. And I think not a lot of people have really looked into this. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, because you think about also what is the main drivers of funding and what are potential problems. If you just go into, let's say,
Yeah.
performance standpoint, obviously there's a ton of stuff in the pathology area.
Hmm.
But I mean, look at how many sports have a risk of just outright head trauma. From mixed martial
Yeah.
arts to potentially soccer to obviously American football.
Yeah.
It just, and you think about at least, where I'm from here, I'm not in Texas, but even in Minnesota, about how many kids grow up playing football, running full
Oh
speed
yeah.
into another human. Like the amount of questions I get from parents, and I don't coach a lot of youth athletes anymore. Like the amount of debates I used to get in about like creatine monohydrate, about how they're so worried that Johnny's 18 now and going to college and he may take creatine, but he got a football scholarship. And I'm like, so you let him run full speed into another human being while he's developing, and you're worried
Yeah.
about the one supplement that may have neuroprotective effects, and we've
Yep.
got like well over 400 peer-reviewed studies on, and that's what you're worried about? It just
Yeah.
seems kind of crazy, but
Yeah, I think from a TBI perspective, you have like delivering substrates. So ketones, creatine, lactate, all those should be considered. But you have people that work in silos that work on like one molecule.
yeah,
So you have a formula, and then you have various cofactors that can open up metabolic pathways and enzymatic pathways. And then you have like inflammation, something like a COX-2 inhibitor. And then you have, modulating reactive oxygen species. And then you have, modulating neurotransmitters. All there's four things, and they can all be sort of combined in a way that can protect people from TBIs. And I think it needs to be a multifaceted approach.
yeah. And there's some rat data showing that I think it was CBD and mixed hemp oil with cannabinoids reduce the blood-brain barrier opening. So mice that got whacked on the head, maybe
Yeah.
if we could talk about something prophylactically,
Yeah.
maybe before a football game or, like before Navy SEAL divers use a rebreather mask, maybe you take something that has a combination of these things. And the earliest entry point would be maybe we can't prove that it statistically reduces concussion or things like that, but depending on the ingredients in it, you could
Yeah.
probably pretty easily prove that it's relatively safe,
Yeah.
depending upon what you're using. And if it's relatively safe and we know that there's not much of a negative downside, there's a potential upside that, maybe we don't really understand. I think a lot of people would probably hedge their bets that direction, I would imagine. So,
Yeah, and you could package it in a way that's a neuroprotective, performance enhancing, potentially performance enhancing compound. And I definitely think, I was on some discussions, some conference calls this week about this, where they're wanting to use this prophylactically, although it's in people who already had concussions, but there's
right.
also an interest in, developing this as a prophylactic treatment. But I don't know. Modern medicine is really just like, just damage control. It's
Yeah.
not a whole lot of time, effort, thought, or funding goes into prophylactic or preventative measures.
Yeah. That's why I thought if you could do it with supplements that are already approved,
Yeah.
then you could market it direct to the consumer and they could
Yeah.
decide this is something I'm going to take, for whatever reason, and just sort of kind of skip that area, get some income, and then you can do more follow-up studies after that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
cool. Well, as we wrap up, I want to be respectful of your time. Any other big projects you're working on or anything else you wanted to talk about for a couple of minutes? I know you always got like 100 different things going on, and I've seen the nice pictures of the
Yeah.
farm there, which is great.
Yeah. That's keep me very busy. Well, I would like to say, I'm focused now on moving the science into human application. So that involves some clinical trials that we're doing, some of it at Duke University, testing this idea of nutritional ketosis for oxygen toxicity. So that's kind of ongoing. And then, we're continuing to partner with on NASA's Extreme Environment Mission Operations, which is the undersea, space analog mission. Although that got postponed due to all the COVID-19
Oh,
craziness.
yeah.
Yes, so we are still gearing up for that mission and maybe a mission in Hawaii called High Seas,
Hmm.
another space analog mission in Hawaii on top of the mountain there. So, and we've been we've packaged the research together and we have it under review now in a high impact journal. So hopefully that gets approved, and we get, so, and that includes HRV data, like some sleep data.
Nice.
And things like that. So I'm very interested in, utilizing different wearables from the perspective of understanding how it changes our metabolic physiology and then important physiological biomarkers, things like sleep, things like gut microbiome. Looking at, my wife is a behavioral neuroscientist, so she looks at behavior and psychology and everything like that. So understanding how these extreme environments affect all those things and how to create countermeasures so we can develop performance resilience in operators who are under these extreme environments. So that's really like the essence of what we're doing now. And I did it in rats for many years. I started doing it in cells, individual cells, and then brain tissue, and then I moved on to rats, and now we're doing humans. And now, like, I was a crew member where I was like a subject where I was like testing these things. So and I want to do more, always have one foot in the basic science, but I get and I'm excited about that, but I get probably equally or more excited about the human applications of it. We're actually doing research in humans. So yeah, that's where we're going. And I hope to share a lot of new things as the restrictions get lifted. We'll start doing more of this research in humans.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I super look forward to that, because I don't think people understand how long of a progression, how many hours and time it takes to go from just starting with a cell culture all the way up to human studies. Is it's mind-boggling.
Yeah. And then the paperwork. Well, I have to give my wife credit for this, because she did like 10 IRB protocols. It's got to go through like your institution, NASA, and also ESA, the European Space Agency, and then that's, probably the hardest part of these missions are actually getting all the IRBs written. And it's not just one, it's like, a dozen just about for all these different experiments we do. So a lot of paperwork, a lot of red tape, but it's fun when you see, when you're actually collecting data and you're making meaningful progress towards things that, we feel, pretty high importance, and not only have implications for like space or undersea, missions, but also the general health too, as we understand how to optimize our performance and mitigate this high stress environment. A lot of that data and the results are translatable to the general public.
Yeah, I think that's what people forget too about military funding, even stuff like DARPA's done. Look at all the interventions that have come out of DARPA that no one, I don't think, would have ever thought of the civilian application at first, but the amount of stuff that just kind of flows downhill from there is pretty massive, independent of the changes that it's made along for the original target, I guess you could say.
Totally. Yeah, DARPA funds a lot of sort of high risk. That my wife has a subcontract. She's funded by DARPA to look at different behavioral stuff that's like above my head, like different like they call it cognitive team cognition. So the dynamics of how a team focuses together, and also like team biology, like how the microbiome of one person if put together in a team could change the microbiome of the entire team, and that could change like your neuropharmacology. Like, DARPA's like interested in these far out ideas, like looking at things like that. So we owe a lot. Like GPS, we owe, like most of the things that we use on a daily basis, we owe to military funding. It's kind of like the initiation of these ideas and the translation of these ideas.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for all your work. Tell your wife hello, and hopefully we'll see you again at some academic conference in the future when they happen, I guess.
Could be a virtual online thing, but well, thanks for having me. I appreciate you giving me your platform to share, what we do.
Anytime.
And look forward. Hopefully we can get together soon at some point in time.
Yeah. Are you going to ISSN in fall in September, or not sure yet?
Maybe. I have to see my schedule, but my schedule will be lighter, I think, in the fall than normal. But it all depends on, these NASA missions that we're doing.
Yeah.
So the dates haven't been set yet. And I have been keeping my calendar clear so I can when they say go, and
Yeah.
no go or no go decision, when they say go, we got to be ready to
Yeah.
actually, implement these protocols. So
Cool. Well, thank you again so much. Greatly appreciate it, and hope to talk to you soon.
thanks, Mike. Take
Awesome.
care.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mike. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. Always greatly appreciate it. I know this one got heavily nerdy. Like I said at the beginning, I just basically ditched all my notes and thought, let's go down some interesting nerdy rabbit holes. Since every time I talk to Dom, I always learn a ton of new stuff. So hopefully you learn some new stuff along the way too. So if you want more information on how to use the concept of metabolic flexibility and flexible dieting, check out the Flex Diet. Go to flexdiet.com. Got a full certification there on how to use nutrition and recovery methods to enhance body composition and performance, both for yourself if you're an advanced lifter or athlete, and it's especially designed if you are a trainer or a coach. It's a complete system to show you how to implement this with your clients. So flexdiet.com. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciate all of you listening in. Take care.